Louis XIV The Sun King, 1638 to 1715.
Now this is the story all about me, the Sun King who ruled France absolutely, and I'm the best bourbon king that Europe has ever seen. I'm a pretty important guy, my name is Louis XIV. In St. Germain-en-Laye, I was born and raised, but Versailles is where I spent most of my days. Neglected by my mom and my dad went and died. Mom left me in a fountain, so I sat there and cried. Then a handful of guys who were up to no good started a little front in my neighborhood. After a few fights, I became rebellion where I gained the love of Versailles and a hate for Paris. I became king at 4 and ruled at 23. I married my first cousin from Spain named Marie. Although she was nice, she didn't make me happy, so I found a mission and said, "Yo, honey, get at me." Hunting lodge, yo, this is bad. Remodeled to a palace that's totally rad. Orangery, Harlem mirrors, the garden and all that. 50 French fountains, that's where it's at. I brought the nobles, won't you help me with my bling? I'm the absolute monarch and it's good to be the king. With my structured schedule, I could keep a watchful eye. The better comply, 'cause I'm the king of Versailles. Later in life, I get into aggression. Frankie ducked Augsburg, the Spanish succession. I gained me some land and I lost me some moolah, but hey, mercantilism, I got plenty. Booyah, I countermandated the Edict of Nantes. I can do what I want, 'cause I'm the Sun King of France. After 70 plus years, my rule's almost done. I'll be giving up the throne to my great-grandson. Now, you've heard of the rising and the setting of the sun, and that I finally died on September 1. I never saw my palace complete to say goodbye, but I'll always be known as Sun King of Versailles.
Part 1. La Fronde, 1648 to 1653.
Louis XIV became king at the tender age of 4 when his father, Louis XIII, died in 1643. At the time, France was entangled in the Franco-Spanish War, which would last another decade. The young king's mother, Anne of Austria, a Habsburg, and Cardinal Mazarin ruled as regents during the first 10 years of his reign. This period witnessed the first wave of rebellion against the regency, as members of the French Parliament revolted against Queen Anne and Cardinal Mazarin. They were asked to pay a tax, but their proposed parliamentary reforms had not yet been accepted by the king. Consequently, they chose rebellion, which ended relatively quickly with a peace treaty. The second wave of rebellion erupted in 1650 when French nobles, seeking more power, went to war against Mazarin, who represented Louis's absolute monarchy. The nobles allied with Spain, despite France being at war with them. Eventually, the French people sided with their king, not the warring nobles. These two rebellions significantly influenced Louis's insistence on absolute rule. Part 2. Personal rule. The emergence of the Sun King, 1661 to 1715. The emergence of the Sun King, 1661 to 1715. Upon Cardinal Mazarin's death in 1661, Louis XIV assumed personal control over the governance of France. In a speech to his ministers and secretaries, he asserted his authority and instructed them to act only on his command.
Up to this moment I have been pleased to entrust the government of my affairs to the late cardinal. It is now time that I govern them myself. You will assist me with your counsels when I ask for them. I request and order you to seal no orders except by my command. I order you not sign anything, not even a passport, without my command, to render account to me personally each day and to favor no one.
Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the Controller General of Finances, was tasked with bringing national spending under control. He introduced a series of tax reforms, creating a transparent system free of favoritism, although the burden remained on the peasants. Much of the tax revenue was used to fund Louis's numerous wars against Spain and the Dutch. Louis XIV championed French-made goods and invited craftsmen to France instead of purchasing from other countries. He employed only French workers to build Versailles and implemented a mercantilist system that extracted resources from colonies to enrich France.
King from the age of 4, Louis XIV would become one of the most famous and longest-reigning monarchs in French history.
Anne of Austria, whose Louis XIV's mother nominally ran the country, while he was a small boy. But there was a man named Mazarin, who really had the reins of government. He was kind of a despot, and he was very manipulative.
When Louis was 9, an uprising called Le Fronde forced him to flee from Paris. Le Fronde ended in 1653, and Louis was crowned in 1654.
Louis never really forgave the nobility who rebelled against the crown. He chose to live outside of Paris most of his reign. He was determined to take traditional powers away from the nobility in France.
In 1660, Louis XIV married Marie Theresa of Spain.
Louis treated the Queen with politeness, even an exaggerated respect due to a daughter of the King of Spain. He also kept mistresses quite openly.
In 1661, Louis's longtime advisor Mazarin died, and rather than appoint a new first minister, Louis shocked France by taking personal control of the government, centralizing the legal system and military. Using French manufacturers and architects, Louis began to build the extravagant Palace of Versailles. But the greater drain on France's treasury was Louis's hunger for war.
On his deathbed, Louis XIV told his great-grandson and successor, the future Louis XV, that he had made war too lightly and too much for his own vanity.
In 1685, Catholic Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had permitted Protestants to openly practice their faith.
Several 100,000 French Protestants, the Huguenots, left France, and this was both economically and culturally devastating for France in the long run.
In 1700, Louis XIV's grandson, Philip of Anjou, was named the heir to the Spanish throne. Philip was also second in line of succession for the French crown.
All of Europe was worried that Spain, with its huge global empire, was going to become united politically to France, the most powerful country militarily in Europe, creating a power that would be completely irresistible.
The War of the Spanish Succession threw the country deeply into debt. After 13 years of fighting, Philip renounced his claim to the French crown and ended the war. Louis had 4 more heirs for the throne, but only one would survive him.
He thought he was leaving this dynasty of boys that could take over from him, one by one. Smallpox, measles, or as I like to say, killed by doctors, which is the reality of the case.
Louis XIV died on September 1st, 1715, leaving the crown to his great-great-grandson.
I think Louis XIV should be remembered as a tragic figure. Somebody who, through his early love for war, left France broken, exhausted, and bankrupt.
By the early 1680s, Louis's reign reached its zenith, with expanded territories, unquestionable control, and abundant wealth. Nobles who wanted to attend court were required to reside at Versailles under Louis's watchful gaze. His motto reflected his absolute rule. Un roi, one king, un loi, one law, un foi, one faith. Part 3. Revoking the Edict of Nantes, 1685. In 1685, Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes, 1598, which granted French Huguenots the right to practice their religion. This followed 5 years of discriminatory measures against Huguenots, such as restricted government participation and forced conversion. The Edict of Fontainebleau declared that all French Protestants were to be forcibly baptized as Catholics. Part 4. The War of the Grand Alliance, 1688 to 1697. The War of the Grand Alliance, 1688 to 1697. Louis and Oppose. Expansionist policies alarmed the rest of Europe. After several key deaths in the Rhineland and Bavaria, Louis sought to install French allies in these regions, prompting European powers to form an alliance against him. The Grand Alliance, comprising Austria, Bavaria, Brandenburg, the Dutch Republic, England, Ireland, the Palatinate of the Rhine, Portugal, Savoy, Saxony, Scotland, Spain, and Sweden, aimed to prevent further French expansion. After 9 years of conflict, they signed the Treaty of Ryswick. The Spanish Succession. War marked the final conflict of Louis and Oppose' life, as France and other European powers battled for control of the Spanish throne in 1700. The death of the king. In 1715, after a remarkable 72-year reign, King Louis XIV passed away at Versailles at the age of 76. He had outlived most of his immediate family, leaving the throne to his 5-year-old great-grandson, Louis Duke of Anjou, who would become King Louis XV.
Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course European History. So today we're moving into the second half of the 17th century. The 30 Years' War has ended with the Treaty of Westphalia, and the scientific revolution is producing amazing new universal laws. But life is still pretty terrible for the vast majority of people. For kings, though, things were changing with the advent of absolutism, in which the king is said to have a divine right to the throne, and the divinest divine right monarch of them all, Louis XIV, led Western Europe's most powerful kingdom for more than 70 years. So this is a portrait of Louis XIV, the French Sun King, painted when he was 63. Louis XIV looks regal in his massive black wig and swaths of ermine embellished with fleurs-de-lis, the symbol of the former French royal house. His high heels show off his shapely legs in white hose, demonstrating the king's perfection. Men's legs, garbed in tightly fitted stockings, were a key indication of desirability at the time, and while he may not appear super masculine to us, Louis XIV was the model of powerful kingship and indeed absolute power. Louis was 4 years old when he started his reign in 1643, while Europe was attempting to pull itself out of the 30 Years' War. Earlier, under Louis's father, Louis XIII, rebellions abounded in the hundreds across the kingdom because of increasingly heavy taxation to pay for the war and the famine conditions due to the relentless Little Ice Age. It seemed almost unthinkable to ordinary people that the king would betray his subjects with rising taxes in a time of famine, so instead they usually blamed tax collectors and local officials, not the king. After Louis XIII died, his 4-year-old son was a smidge small for France ruling, so the job was taken over by his regent, his mother Anne of Austria, with help from her sidekick and rumored lover, the Italian-born Cardinal Mazarin. The first years of Anne's regency were the last years of the 30 Years' War, and she increased French military deployments even amid all these protests with the simple and eventually successful goal of defeating the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs to gain more territory. Alongside increasing the desperation of ordinary people, this constant warfare stretched aristocratic resources because nobles raised and paid for their own armies in wartime. Louis's mother had to move him several times to keep him safe amid protests from peasants and nobility alike, some of whom even went to the point point of plotting coups d'etat, which is, after all, a French phrase. The pieds nus, or barefooted ones, the croquants, or crunchers, or crispies, and even judges of Paris were among the people resisting. One judge listed the sacrifices of ordinary people, such as selling all their furniture and sleeping on straw in order to pay rising taxes. He said, to maintain the luxury of Paris, millions of innocent souls are obliged to live on black bread and oats. Did the center of the world just open? Is there a pumpernickel bagel in there? It's the closest we could get to black bread. Now this is a properly great bagel. I'm gonna eat that whole thing once this is done. But black bread in 17th century France, not good. For one thing, it was often cut with sawdust, which, isn't ideal for bread making, and also isn't ideal for nutrition. In fact, our contemporary bread is so good that it's hard for us to imagine just how difficult the circumstances were in the 17th century, like just how desperate you have to be to add sawdust to your dough. So we're gonna jump back in time for a bit. Earlier in the 17th century, a group of judges managed to undermine the monarchy, if only temporarily. You'll recall that France ended their religious civil war with Henry, Paris's well worth a mass, IV ruling. Henry was Louis XIV's grandfather, and to pay for ongoing wars, Henry raised a new tax called the paulette that was paid by government officials, including judges, over a 9-year period. And if you paid the paulette, you could keep your job for life, or even sell your job to a successor, and this created a powerful class of bureaucrats who were basically immune from state oversight. But Henry couldn't afford to get rid of the paulette because he needed the cash to wage wars. The officials who bought their positions came to be known as the nobles of the robe, as opposed to the old school nobles who were called the nobles of the sword because they'd gotten their status via military service to the king. Flash forward a few decades, Anne of Austria and Cardinal Mazarin are trying to throw these nobles of the robe out of office, which the new nobles are of course not keen on, leading Anne to threaten to arrest them. I mean, after all, they'd paid a lot of money for those robes. All of this pushed the people of Paris to their most menacing protest until the monarchy backed down and released the judges that they had imprisoned. And this triumph over the monarchy made the nobility of the robe a force to be reckoned with, and also indicated that maybe the absolute power of the monarchy wasn't actually that absolute. Alongside these protesters, another contender for influence arose. A new Catholic movement, Jansenism, called for a complete purging of the self and a fervent spirituality to replace the insufficient and even deluded practices of the church. Like, for instance, being a cardinal who is probably hooking up with the king's mom. The Jansenists believe only intense and full religious commitment could pull France from its dire straits, and they menaced established authority. But the most threatening uprising was the Fronde, a series of opposition movements between 1648 and 1653, in which the old nobility and the courts were like, you can't just raise our taxes willy-nilly without asking permission, and Anne of Austria was like, of course we can, it's a kingdom, and we are, well, if not exactly the king, at least the king's regent and her sidekick. Let's go to the thought bubble. Louis XIV was officially crowned king in 1654 when he was 15, and as he grew older, his urgent task became organizing the administration of his kingdom, raising funds, and uniting his subjects in loyalty to him. Part of his brilliance was to divert the nobility, and in fact a good part of France, with a spectacular court life, rather how a parent might divert a relentless, unhappy child with, say, an iPad. But Louis's court was even more diverting than, I don't know what kids like, TikTok? In the 1660s, the king began the task of removing his government from the tumult of Paris by converting a hunting lodge at Versailles outside of Paris into the most spectacular European palace complex of its day. It housed some 15,000 people when the court moved there in the 1680s, and further thousands in the many adjacent buildings for servants and smaller chateaux built for Louis's mistresses. The nobility was kept busy attending to the king and queen, as well as serving the monarch's legitimate and many illegitimate children. They also outdid themselves in maneuvering for status, one of the highest honors being to hand the king his nightshirt in the evening, or to oversee his use of the commode. The king also sponsored and sometimes starred in spectacular operas and concerts and plays to add to the feeling of his greatness and power, while the nobility enhanced the scene by behaving as if the king were in fact more than humanly powerful. It was almost like the king was a bright sun whose presence warmed all those it graced, and indeed, that's why Louis XIV came to be known as the Sun King. Thanks, Thought Bubble. In the days of absolutism, monarchs across Europe embraced the idea that they had the divine right to their absolute rule. The Bishop Jacques Binier-Boussu preached in the Royal Chapel of Versailles that, quote, "It is God who establishes kings. He vested royalty in the house of David and ordered him to cause Solomon, his son, to reign in his place. Princes thus act as ministers of God." He continued, "This is why we have seen that the royal throne is not the throne of a man, but the throne of God himself." To his mind, God has placed in princes something divine, and in fact, Boussu maintained, princes are gods. The king's divinity allowed for his regime to be free from arbitrariness or the tyranny of anarchy because whatever he did was necessarily correct. Louis XIV probably never said the line most famously attributed to him, "L'état c'est moi," or "the state is me," but it has endured for a reason. He really was the state's power and authority, and he felt that even if he never said it. But divine right theory also meant religious conformity. Louis XIV viewed the presence of Protestants in his realm as disorderly and sinful, causing him to revoke the Edict of Nantes in 1685. Thousands of Protestants then fled France, taking their skills and successful businesses to the Netherlands, the German states, North America, South Africa, and other places. And for all the surface grandeur of Louis's regime, it worked mostly because of accomplished bureaucrats, including the intendants, or intendants if I'm pretending to be able to pronounce French, whose jobs were regularized to oversee tax collections and the administrations of the various regions of the kingdom. The most prominent and important of all Louis's officials was Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who oversaw finances and public works, among other things. Despite being of middle-class birth, Colbert drove the kingdom's economy, including its merchants, shipbuilders, and artisans. Colbert also oversaw French expansion into North America, sending out settlers and officials. Traders combed the continent for the desperately needed furs that were in high demand during the intense cold of the Little Ice Age. Colbert is most famous for his support of mercantilism, a policy that saw economic development and trade as akin to war. Mercantilist thinkers believed that there was only so much wealth in the world, a finite and fixed amount, and in such a zero-sum world, the only way for one kingdom to win would be for other kingdoms to lose. We now know this isn't true, but mercantilism was an important driver of policy and foreign relations at the time. There were many applications of this theory, refusing entry of another kingdom's ships, for instance, or enacting high tariffs on competitors' goods. We can see one example of this in cotton textiles, which were wildly popular, but Europeans had no idea how to produce such lively and washable fabrics, so they were outlawed in France. Smuggling, however, thrived, with women and men alike wearing cotton, and even high officials brought them in illegally. In this and other areas of life, people did disobey absolutist rules. Still, Louis had a lot of power, including the power to wage war. He waged 4 major ones. First, the War of Devolution, in which France gained territory in the north. Second, the Dutch War, which gained additional land to the north and along the eastern border. Third, the War of the League of Augsburg, in which he lost much of the land won in the Dutch War. And fourth, the War of the Spanish Succession, again with significant losses, including in Canada, this time to Britain, who you might not have expected to be mixed up in the Spanish War of Succession, but everyone wanted in on warring in 17th century Europe. Clearly, like the ideal reality TV contestant, Louis was not there to make friends, but we can see through this exchange of lands through endless war how a zero-sum, I can only win if you lose worldview ends up exhausting resources rather than expanding them. By the end of his reign, the idea of absolutist rule was being thrown into question. An English critic called absolutist France a state full of boils and wounds and putrid sores. Exiled Huguenots called the French under Louis slaves. His rule directed only, quote, to satisfy both his ambition and his vengeance. Again, satisfying one's ambition and one's vengeance makes you a great reality TV contestant, but maybe not necessarily the perfect king. So absolutism can be seen as a form of tyrannical rule demanding religious, economic, and social conformity based on a political theory of monarchical divinity. It cost huge amounts in taxation and loss of life in wars to create this system of servility to royal power, and it was pretty disempowering to the French public. But then again, the rise of a political system of power sharing in England called constitutionalism wasn't really less violent, although it did enshrine certain ideas about human rights. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching Crash Course European History, which is made by all of these nice people and filmed here in the Jaden Smith studio in Indianapolis. Our animators are Thought Cafe. We have lots more Crash Course available. You want to learn about astronomy, computer science? We got you covered. Thanks again for watching, and don't forget to be awesome.
Hey there, students. In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Louis XIV. Oh, that's the Sun King, you say? Yeah, that is the Sun King. You know that. Awesome. You know who else knows that? Everybody. Yes, you need to listen to this lecture. Let me teach you a little bit more about Louis XIV. To really understand Louis XIV's impact on France as an absolute monarch, we need to look at the history of France, which they had a tradition of weak kings. Their symbol was the fleur de lis, which is a lily flower. And when you think about a lily flower as a symbol, is that really fit for a king? Think about it. It's like, oh, here's my symbol. It's a flower. Woo! Now, France had a tradition of weak kings. If we look here, King Charles VII, who, really, why do you have to know him? You don't. He was one of the kings of France during the 100 Years' War when the English were just destroying France for the most part and taking over half his country. And unable to really do anything himself, Charles calls on a teenage girl, Joan of Arc, who found a sword in a field, and it's like, okay, teenage girl, help us. And France had tons of forgettable kings. I don't think I even know any of these guys' names. Nice thing is, I don't have to. They're not important. In fact, some of them are almost comical. This guy, dude, pants, okay? Like, it's a good thing. How's anybody supposed to take you seriously dressed like that? Really? Louis XIII is yet another forgettable French monarch. We might remember even more his first minister, Cardinal Richelieu, who was so important that he had a painting of him like, hey, get me like this. Oh, now this. Now this. Yeah. You know this guy's important. I don't think Louis XIII has a picture like that. Now, Louis XIII had a problem. He was childless. They had stillborn children, similar situation to Henry VIII. But instead of divorcing his wife, Louis XIII dedicated his whole country to the Virgin Mary. And good for him, the Virgin Mary delivered. And within a year, Louis Dieudonné. Now, I may have just slaughtered that. That's French. This is a history lecture, not a lecture in the French language. But Louis the God-given. So they have this God-given son who arrives. And he was very much a mama's boy. His mama wanted a son so bad. Keep in mind that it was typical for aristocratic women back then not to pay a lot of attention to their kids, to let somebody else raise them. But Louis got a lot of attention from his mother, and even more so once his father died and she was the only one left. So Louis's father died when Louis was 4 years old, and so Louis became king very, very early. Now, of course, you're not going to let a 4-year-old make decisions for your country. Anne of Austria, Louis's mother, was the regent while Louis was younger. But then again, most of the decisions are being made by Cardinal Mazarin, who was the chief minister of France during Louis's minority. During Cardinal Mazarin's ministry, the biggest problem France faced was the Fronde, which is French for sling. And this was a revolt of nobles and Parisian townspeople while Louis was younger. Now, Louis was kind of kept out of the details of this, but he knew something was going on. And when Louis won, he was resolved to never let this happen again. Louis was going to be a different kind of king. Louis was going to be the type of king that would not be rebelled against, the type of king that would be so big that no one would ever think about challenging him, kind of like Hobbes' Leviathan, or a figure that big. For his symbol, Louis wasn't going to be satisfied with a flower. Instead, Louis chose the sun as his symbol and decided that he would be known as the Sun King.
Sun King!
And now, of course, the sun is over everything. The sun is something that we can all look at and admire, not just something that grows out of the ground that you can pick for your girlfriend or something like that. The sun inspires awe. Now, where did this come from? Louis was actually, when he was younger, a ballet dancer, and in one of the ballets that he was in, he played the Greek sun god Apollo. Nice little bit of Louis trivia for you. So not only is he the sun, but this also symbolizes a sort of godlike magnificence that Louis seeks to project. One of Louis's most famous quotes is "L'État c'est moi." Hope I said that right. But in English, that means I am the state. So Louis wasn't going to be like his father and just go hunting and chase women. Louis was going to go hunting and chase women and rule, to be the king personally. Louis didn't appoint a first minister per se. Louis was his own first minister, and he would make the final decisions. One of the most famous sayings associated with Louis is un roi, un la, un foi. I may have just slaughtered that. Again, it's French, but in English it means one king, one law, one faith.
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 So I'm going to go into very quickly how Louis pursued each of these goals. First of all, the goal of one king. Louis made sure that these nobles, who'd been very powerful in France, knew who was boss. He made nobles attend to him at Versailles. You see in this picture here, one of Louis's nobles who is ascending this really grand staircase, and he is bowing to Louis, who is at the top of the staircase awaiting him. Louis made sure that he was always surrounded with splendor and majesty. And these nobles had to attend him regularly at Versailles. So anyone who was anybody was supposed to be there where Louis was, wearing the most stylish clothes and spending all kinds of money to stay current with the latest fashions, to gamble, to show off, and to compete for Louis's favor. Now, let's say there was a noble who decided, hey, I don't have to go over there. I'm not going to go make a fool of myself there at Versailles. Well, when he needed a favor, Louis would be like, huh, who? I don't know that guy. He never comes to see me. And so if you knew it was good for you, you better go over there and do what Louis says. And Louis would, in order to tick off these old nobles, the sword nobles, Louis created a whole bunch of robe nobles. He gave away these offices that came with noble titles. Actually, he didn't give them away. He sold them. And this is how Louis came up with a source of independent revenue. Louis came up with all of this money that he got by selling titles, and this is what paid for Louis's wars. Now, the thing is that this is kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul, because the nobles that were being created, they pay all this money up front, and then they get all kinds of tax exemptions later. So Louis's got a lot of money in his pocket, but he's stealing from future generations, and this is starting the process of financial ruin that is eventually going to lead to the French Revolution. because of all of this money that Louis's got coming in, he never has to call the Estates General, which was the French representative body that had to consent to taxation. They were rendered unnecessary and never had to meet. And in fact, they wouldn't meet for about 175 years, not until 1789, which was the eve of the French Revolution. Next, Louis sought to be one law in France. One of the things that he did to bring this about was the Code Louis, which was an effort to standardize laws throughout the nation. Louis inherited a kingdom that was very much set in its ways locally. Northern France and southern France would have different ways of going about the law. And Louis said we need to have the law the same across the whole French nation. And so while this is not as famous as the Napoleonic Code that followed later, he is really kind of setting Napoleon up. This is kind of the building blocks of the Napoleonic Code. So Louis deserves a bit of credit here. Finally, Louis sought for there to be one faith in France. Now, Louis's grandfather, Henry IV, issued the Edict of Nantes, or the Edict of Nantes, whatever you want to call it. It's a written test, Nantes. And the Edict of Nantes gave Huguenots some toleration, allowed them to practice their religion in various places. You can check out my video on the French Wars of Religion if you'd like. Now, Henry had inherited a kingdom that was very divided about religion. In fact, Henry was a Huguenot, a French Calvinist, and he decided to convert to Catholicism. Paris is worth the mass, as he put it. And Louis, unlike Henry, who was a politique and converted for political reasons, Louis was a very devout Catholic. And Louis decided, hey, the Edict of Nantes creates two faiths in this country. I want one. So Louis revokes the Edict of Nantes and decides that from now on, Catholicism will be the only faith in France. Louis wrote in the Edict of Fontainebleau, which rescinded the Edict of Nantes, that we have determined that we can do nothing better in order to wholly obliterate the memory of the troubles, the confusion, and the evils which the progress of this false religion has caused in this kingdom, than entirely to revoke the said Edict of Nantes. This false religion. Now keep in mind that Louis, although he's trying to get power. I mean, having one religion makes the monarch more powerful. But keep in mind also that Louis considered himself a divine right monarch. And Louis felt like he had an obligation to the souls of his people in order to make sure that they weren't practicing a religion that was false. So don't discount Louis's religious motives here, but keep in mind he's also got a power motive at work here. In this picture, you can see a French Huguenot temple being torn down outside of Paris as a result of the Edict of Fontainebleau. And here is a Huguenot church in Charleston, South Carolina, not too far from where I am. And this was put there by some French Huguenots who left the country. There was some immigration because of the Edict of Fontainebleau. Now, let's not exaggerate, not massive immigration. I'm not speaking French, I'm speaking English. The English left their country in droves, not the French. But keep in mind that there were some French Huguenots who left France in order to practice their religion freely elsewhere. Now, just because Louis is enforcing Catholicism as the one faith of France doesn't mean that Louis is going to bow down to the Pope. After all, he is king. Louis embraces the concept of Gallicanism, which says that the Pope is the spiritual leader of the church, but the Pope cannot make decisions in France which affect the French body politic. So therefore, Louis should be able to have some input. The Pope is not going to invade Louis's territory and act as a king inside France. Now, Gallicanism comes from the word Gaul, which was the Roman word for France. So really, this means the French church. In some ways, similar to the idea of Anglicanism, but it still involves the French recognizing the religious authority of the Pope. Now, of course, the Pope wasn't too happy about this, but then again, Louis was a devout Catholic, but above all, he was king. When Louis was alive, he said, "L'État c'est moi," I am the state. When he died, his last words were, "I am leaving you, but the state remains forever." I'm going away. And yes, I was a big egomaniac who went to war and all that kind of stuff and tried to consolidate my power, but I have also built a nation. And so he says, I'm leaving you, but the state remains forever. I didn't do this just for my ego. I also did it for France. Stay tuned for another lecture about Louis XIV's wars, and also, if you'd like more historical goodness, feel free to subscribe to my channel so that I can prepare you for whatever exam you're taking. I do some U.S. history as well. Also, be on the lookout for more videos. I'll recommend a couple to you in just a bit. Until next time.
Say, I am the state.